Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now today's video is sponsored by Warlord Games in association with their upcoming release, Achtung Panzer. And it is a game of tank-on-tank combat which takes place initially for most of the late war period. So there's four main nations, Allies and the Germans of course, and that means eventually we're going to get into the snow. And that's always the fun part. I love painting winterized tanks. So Warlord very kindly sent me along the Panther here, and I'm going to show you how you can whitewash your vehicles very easily and mix up snow sludge out of nothing but baking soda and PVA. So as always, the paints for this one will be listed in the description below. Nice and quick, let's get started. Now once your tank's assembled, it's time to go ahead and prime it. Now I've used here Dunkelgelb from Vallejo. It's a primer spray. It is quite a good dark yellow, Dunkelgelb, but it's not quite spot on for this later war yellow that I want. So what I have now is Middlestone, and this is a little soft makeup brush because I want to be able, first of all, just quickly scrub across the flat panels and get a fairly easy coat there. But it also needs to be something that I can get a little bit rough with and stipple into all of the Zimmerit that's on the tank itself. The fun thing about Zimmerit, this anti-tank mine paste, it was designed to be anti-magnetic, but by the time it was developed and started being put on German tanks, it was Germans who were the ones who were most commonly using anti-tank mines. Magnetic mines. Pretty much everybody else, they were still available, but they weren't the threat that all of this extra weight really merited, so it's quite funny. But all the same, it's nice and quick to paint. There's quick little stippling motions to make sure you get into all of the little nooks and crannies of this stuff. And then on the flat panels, bang, 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 nice and easy. Now my poor camera doesn't quite know what to do about these colors, but once we've finished up, I'll get a much better looking photograph that you'll be able to see. And what I'm going to start with, this is a little bit of Refractive Green, just with some medium in it, and a little round dry brush. And all I'm going to do is just roughly start blocking out where I want my green camo pattern to appear. Now you'll see I'm not being terribly careful about this at all. Honestly, once we've finished with our whitewashing, a lot of this is going to disappear. So don't worry if it's not perfect. You're just blobbing out a camo pattern. Now you may find it easier to actually swap to a flatter edged brush. This is the one that I use to apply our base coat. Don't worry if at first you're not getting a solid color because, again, we're going to do quite a bit to this. For now, we're just getting a slightly feathered edge with our rough brushing. Now, of course, it's going to look a little bit patchy when it first goes on, so off we go with the second coat. This one will be much easier because you can really just concentrate on the bits where you're getting some of the primer showing through. Now once your green is nice and solid, we're going to do the same thing again with saddle brown. Now it doesn't have to be saddle brown. Something like German camo medium brown will also work quite well here. I quite like using saddle brown because it is a little bit red, and we're starting to get into the period of the war when you're seeing more hull red in your camo patterns. Technically speaking, a darker brown would probably be more accurate, but I am also concerned by the rule of cool, and I do like my saddle brown for that. Burnt umber is also a very good replacement for this. It is light enough to still look pretty good, but not so much so that it looks cartoonish. So pick something you like, and as you can see, I'm just slowly stippling out these little patches. Same thing applies. Anything you do to the hull, remember, we've got the turret there to do it to as well. Now, one of the really handy things about this is that you don't actually have to worry about doing it to the wheels, because early on, the camouflage patterns were applied to the road wheels, but the Germans learned very quickly that spinning, the dazzle effect of a spinning color, which would be visible when the tank was in motion, actually drew the eye of enemy gunners. Not what you want a camo pattern to do. So they stopped applying it to the wheels, which means you don't have to apply it either. Nice and simple. But we are going to mix up our shade mix for the tank. Now, I found it easiest recently using here, this is Agrax Earthshade and Lahmian Medium. Big old bottle for the medium because I use tons of this stuff. Easy as, I'm going to mix it up in a 1-to-1 ratio. You could just use Agrax Earthshade straight from the bottle for this, but because of the Zimmerit, the texture here is going to make the tank look quite dark if you just apply neat shade over the top. So this is going to go over everything. If you get big blobs of this at the bottom, you see like it's settled here, just wick it away with your brush and apply it somewhere else. So over our entire Panther, here we go with our shade mix. Goodness me, that does not want to behave. So once that has had plenty of time to dry, I've just popped the turret on so that we can get a look at the whole thing in context. Now don't worry if your camo doesn't match between turret and hull, because as folks are quite keen on pointing out, a lot of the time these camo patterns were applied in the field rather than at a factory, so they don't always match perfectly. If you do want it to look right, then what you can do is pop the turret on as you're applying those first few stippling brush strokes of the color, and it will, you'll know where it's going to be. But this works fine. But from here, we're going to do a little bit of color modulation, as we have done on some of the other vehicles before we get to our whitewashing. Now, because Middlestone is quite a light color to begin with, what I've got for my mix here, this is 3 parts of Middlestone, and then just 1 little droplet of Iraqi Sand. This is quite a similar mix to pretty much all the others we've done on other vehicles on the channel so far. Just work some of it off on a bit of paper, and then you can... I always like to use the turret ring as a point to figure out what this is going to look like. Once you're satisfied with the color, start on some of the flat panels, and with little scrubbing motions, just work on some of this color mix to give a slightly lighter color towards the center of the flat panels. Now, interestingly enough, I'm actually not going to do this at all on the Zimmerit, not yet. We are going to do something with that later, but for now, I'm content with just brightening up some of this flat Middlestone mix. You'll see at the moment it's a little bit patchy and maybe not all that pronounced. You can push it a little bit further by adding more Iraqi Sand to that step, but it's up to you. I think subtle is a little bit better. Now I'm going to paint in the black details with some black grey, and I recommend when it comes to painting in the road wheels, exciting as this part is to paint one side at a time. Me being right-handed, I find it easier to paint the right side of the wheels. And then, once I've done all of these, flip it upside down and do the same thing in the opposite direction. Other stuff like machine guns and what have you, you can also paint in at this step. Pretty much anything that's going to be either black metal or rubber. Now that won't take you too terribly long. You'll see, for the most part, the rear road wheels, I haven't bothered painting the rubberized sections on them. It's not going to matter by the time we apply all of our weathering. So now comes the marginally less entertaining part, and that is to take some burnt umber. I'm going to go over all of the tracks. Oh boy, this is the bit that takes a while. As well, don't forget the track sections that are attached to the sides of the hull. If you've got any up on the turret as well, maybe you've converted, don't forget that. And likewise, I'm also going to apply the burnt umber to the exhaust system here on the back. Now afterwards, prep out a dry brush. I've got here some oily steel, but any metallic color will do quite well here. As you can see, there's a little bit of the yellow showing through from the primer on these things. Oops. Oh well, but as I say, you're not going to need to worry too much about this being perfect. Just quickly blast over the top of these, because as with everything, we're going to end up covering quite a bit with our weathering and our snow effect later. And then one of the last steps is to get some beige brown and just fill in some of the tool handles. Quite a lot of these would be sprayed on the vehicle so that they end up the same color as the camo that they are sitting on top of. But I tend to like making them stand out a little bit. There's not normally very many of these, so just a quick squiz round, golden. Now while that's off to the side drying, we're going to apply our transfers. Now I like putting down a little bit of kitchen towel and just soaking it with water, because once the transfers come off the backing paper, I can just leave them on the damp towel and keep working with them at my own pace. I've put a little bit of microset on the side of the turret where I'm going to put these numbers on. While this is a bit that needs a little bit of practice, it's not too much to slide that off your brush roughly into position. And while it is still not set, you can poke it around, get a little bit of water on your brush to flood underneath, and shift it as you need to get it into position. Now you might see, as transfers dry, they will naturally shrink and tighten a little bit against the surface that they've been applied to. But for something like Zimmerit, an extremely textured surface, a little bit of microsol won't hurt. Now, there's all sorts of decal softeners and what have you out there. I know Vallejo does a very good one. I'm using microsol because I've always used it, and this bottle has lasted me more than 8 years. It's good stuff. Just a couple of quick passes with a brush load of this. Just gently work it into the backing paper so that'll soften up, and as it dries again, those decals will take that shape much more naturally. Now while those transfers dry, we can apply our whitewash. Now making this is pretty easy. What I've done is add about 2 parts water to 1 part of off-white. You can use a pure white, you could use an ivory or something, but off-white is going to work for me. I want it nice and runny, and then what I've got is one of these little packing foam sections, just from a blister. I've cut it and just pinched it between a pair of pliers. Now comes the hard part, working up the courage. What I'm going to do is start dabbing this over the miniature. You can see I get a nice patchy finish, as though someone has quite hurriedly thrown this on with a bucket. Now apply it first like this, and you want to push down a little bit harder as you get to some of these areas. But you'll see, because it's quite thin, we are going to get a little bit of the primer, so not primer, the color underneath still showing through. So I'm going to go around pretty much the entire miniature. You could mask it off if you wanted to, but this feels a little bit more, applied in the field with a sponge kind of deal. So over pretty much everything, away we go with our whitewash. Let's see how this comes out. And just so you can see a bit of in progress here, it's, it can be difficult to keep the faith. But anywhere that you're not getting proper coverage, what you can do is just dab over the top of it again. Same as I did for the helmets on my German winter infantry. If you see me paint those, it's a very similar process. Now once again, quickly popping the turret on so that you get a feel for the whole thing. As you can see, I've avoided the markings there, and I've also put just a little bit less on the engine decking. I tend to figure that they would probably be scrambling over this quite a bit, so you're going to wear off that whitewash fairly quickly. Now that is messy, and if you do end up getting little chunks of paint, where little bubbly bits have dried, all the better. A little bit of texture with this won't hurt. But what we're actually going to do now is go back to some of our original camo colors and use those as weathering steps rather than chipping armor. So we're going to start with Refractive Green, and again, a little bit of packing foam and our tweezers, and just dip some of that onto my brush, I guess this is, and just some of the areas where you know that there would be chipping and this whitewash being worn away. Go over it with a little bit of the green. Now in particular, you want to focus on areas where the crew would be moving around a lot. So up on the hatch here, I'm going to ding this a couple of times, and let's follow their path over the edge of the tank. Now this, you can very quickly take off a lot of white rather, but it will look pretty cool. and it does look a little bit more realistic. So I am going to chip this up quite a bit and give us a little bit more to look at with our whitewash. So we'll now do the same thing again with our saddle brown. And then, once we finish with this, we're going to do it with the Middlestone. And that's part of the reason why we didn't do much of the edges of things with Middlestone mix, because we want to be able to go back to it for our chipping here and have it be the right color without having to mix up again. And then, last of all, with some Middlestone. And here I think you'll see what I mean by making it look as if the camo is really starting to wear off. With all three colors on, it looks a lot more natural. So yeah, take your time with it and really ding this thing around. It's going to look cool as. So there we have our chipped and worn whitewash. Now, for a camo pattern in the winter months, you could leave it like this, but I really want to add some sludge. I enjoy doing this step. So I'm going to put this aside for a second, and we will make our snow paste. Now I've got a little plastic lid here from an old spray can. Anything plastic will do, something which isn't going to soak up the mess we're about to make. So this is PVA glue, and it has been watered down already because I quite like using it for my basing. But a wee bit of this in the bottom here. And then what I've got is a big old container. I've ripped this open earlier. This is baking soda. And this is just the right kind of consistency for snowflakes at this kind of scale. So I'm going to add some of this in and put this aside so I can stir it up. And it is important here that you use a proper scrunkly old brush. Basically, the thicker the paste you make, the older and more caked on the snow is going to look. So at the moment, you can see it's still quite runny. This would be good if I want to chuck it around hatches or on the deck, but I want a much thicker mix than this because I'm going to pop this on my tracks. So add some more baking soda. And unfortunately, it's a little bit difficult to show you exactly what to expect on camera because it is quite difficult to capture the gloopiness. But you see, when I can run a brush through it, and it takes a couple of seconds to start firming up again, this is getting closer to what I want. I'm going to add just a little bit more. All right. Now this thick, chunky paste, this is going to look quite like something like Valhalla Blizzard from CITADEL, which you can also use here. This is just a little bit cheaper, and it is a lot of fun to make. So load up your gloop, grab your tank, and start applying this everywhere that you would expect to see snow start collecting or be driven up. So around the tracks is going to be a pretty good candidate for this. And as you see, because it is quite sticky, you're going to have to really work it off your brush in some places. But don't be afraid to swap your brush and grab a bigger one intermittently as you need it. So also be applying this in places like along the bottom of the armour. But yeah, have some fun now. This is where we really get to make a mess. Now this stuff will look super gloopy as it is applied, but as it dries, it's going to look much less shiny and glossy. If you want, what you can do is to get a little bit of gloss varnish, mix that into your sand, so your snow mix if you fancy, but I don't think you're going to need to. Just as you're applying this, try and keep away from areas like the engine deck where you're going to see a lot of heat. I haven't applied any to the gun for the same reason. But yeah, you can go as nuts with this as you fancy because it is really, really fun. It absolutely destroys brushes though, so bear that in mind. Only use awful old stuff you don't mind losing. But once this has had some time to dry, I'm going to pop it up on the radiator. We'll get a look at our finished ice-cold Panther. And there at last, our winterized Panther is complete. Now there is a lot you can do to these things. You could go ahead and add some of the weathering, like the rust details and what have you, that I have done on other tanks of this period. But I think by the time you've applied your whitewash and all of that gunk, it's not really going to show up all that much. So pick your battles and apply what's really going to work. Now you'll probably see as this goes around that the sludge I applied has dried a little more translucent than it was when it first went on. So you can see now how you can apply quite a bit of it, but think about where snow would naturally collect on a vehicle like this. So thank you again to Warlord for letting me have the Panther to play around with, and as well to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, and all of my wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue and baking soda, including my gorgeous producers who are showing up on screen now. Your support keeps this channel going, folks. Now, any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.